Welcome back to the Journal of Samuel Kelly. Last time, Samuel joined the crew of a coastal trading ship and journeyed to Marseille. Other stops included islands around Italy, before departing finally to Philadelphia in America. Over the course of the trip, Samuel was forced to keep law and order aboard the boat due to his captain becoming too familiar with the crew and enjoying gambling a bit too much. Arriving in Philadelphia, they offloaded supplies, and finding no supplies to go back to Great Britain, they departed with supplies for Kingston, Jamaica, where we find Samuel now. The beginning of the year 1788, we left Philadelphia, but did not leave the Capes of Delaware until the 7th, the wind being strong from the southward. We experienced much bad weather after sailing, and was led far to the eastward before we could shape a southerly course. The squalls were so frequent and heavy with rain, thunder, and lightning that we were often obliged to clew up our sails to prevent their being blown from the yards. At 3 in the afternoon of the 2nd of August, we saw the island of Grand Turk, and before sunset entered the passage between it and the Great Corcos. On the 3rd, we saw Hispaniola and Fortunatus, and on the 4th passed Cape Nicolemont. On the 5th at night, we were nearly overset by a violent squall, and as the hurricane season was now set in, we were not a little alarmed till it abated, as our ship was totally unfit for carrying a press of sail. On the 7th passed the island of Navassa, and saw the Blue Mountains in Jamaica. The 8th got a pilot, and in the evening passed Port Royal and anchored off Greenwich. The 9th we arrived at Kingston and hauled to Mr. Isaac Blight's wharf, to whom our cargo was consigned. We found very few vessels here, as the hurricane season was set in. The men of war had quitted Port Royal and were now at anchor before this town, with yards and topmasts struck. His Royal Highness the Duke of C commanded one of the frigates. Whilst our vessel was discharging the cargo, I made inquiry about my old master, Mr. Byrne, who formerly persuaded me to desert my ship to be his clerk. But I found he was dead, and the woman of color, Mary Morris, who formerly lived with him, was now in jail for debt, and I saw the negress belonging to her whom I knew now advertised in the newspaper for sale. One Sabbath afternoon, instead of keeping the day holy and visiting a place of worship, I undertook to conduct my captain to Spring Path, a great burial ground for Negroes, where those still living generally dance to music of their own invention, such as jawbone of some animal with a stick rubbed up and down the teeth, a tin box with small pebbles or shot therein, a hollow piece of a tree with a piece of skin spread thereon. In short, anything that would make a noise would suit their purpose to dance to. Whilst passing near this scene of riot, a negress ran after us, calling Massa Cap'n, who informed us that her mistress wanted to see us. We thought she was mistaken in our persons, but on looking where she directed us, we discovered our washerwoman, a Sambo, inviting us to her dwelling, which we entered and seated ourselves. She soon produced some punch, and on seeing a cake woman in the street, called her and asked us to treat herself and companions with cakes, which was complied with. This woman, dressed in a large brown beaver hat, with several rows thereon of silver lace and buckles, which I think could not be very far short of the value of 2 guineas and a half, but what she prided herself most in was out of sight, namely, a quantity of fine muslin and other petticoats which she was desirous of displaying, and accordingly showed that she had on either 5 or 7. A few days after this, a white man was exhibited in the pillory for decoying Negroes from their owners. Round him, in a principal street, a vast number of women of color were assembled in most expensive dresses, but they were soon defiled and many ruined by rotten eggs thrown. Few were aimed at the pillory, the greatest part being leveled at the ladies' fine beavers, which made them squall into camp as fast as possible. In the afternoons, a number of negresses carrying about candles on boards upon their heads for sale, and as hard candles are most saleable, they are directed to call or cry, here candle, burn like a wax, hard like a stone. But sometimes forgetting their lesson, they cry, hard like a wax, burn like a stone. We had lain the ship on the ground whilst discharging at Mr. Blight's wharf, and the fresh sea breezes had caused her to wallow in the surf, so as to make her leaky, which was unpleasant at the commencement of lading. But as we were daily in fear of a hurricane from a northerly wind sometimes blowing, and heavy white clouds often hanging over the Blue Mountains, edged with the color of a rainbow, our captain was determined to persevere in leaving the island as soon as possible. On the 25th I was directed to proceed with the ship to Port Royal, whilst our captain remained in Kingston to settle with the consignees. In the evening he came on board, and soon after dark a tremendous fire burst out suddenly at Kingston, which illuminated our ship and the objects around, although at 5 miles distance. 2 or 3 stores were consumed by the carelessness of a Negro in stealing rum, which he set on fire. The 26th, early in the morning at gunfire, before which no vessel is permitted to leave Port Royal, we sailed for Old Harbor, and the same afternoon our longboat fetched on board some hogsheads of sugar. As we proceeded with our lading, our leak kept increasing, so that we had to pump every 2 hours, and at last every hour. The captain and myself had some conversation respecting the state of the ship, when we concluded to proceed to sea. Accordingly, we endeavored to keep the men in good humor, and sailed from Old Harbor for London the 15th of September, 1788, intending to run into one of the ports in the United States should we find it requisite. The 16th we departed from Negril Port. The 18th we saw the Grand Cayman. The weather was unsettled for several days with much thunder and lightning. The 25th at daylight we found ourselves very near a low island, belonging to the labyrinth of the Jardines de Reina on the south coast of Cuba. The 30th we saw the Dolphin head not far from the Havana, and to our great astonishment saw the double-headed shot keys on the 2nd of October, by which we found the current was running very strong to the east. The captain and myself were strangers to the Gulf of Florida, for though I had often been at Jamaica in the packets, we always beat to windward, and went through one or other of the passages of the Bahama Islands. The 4th we saw the Grand Bahama Islands, and also saw a fish as long as a ship's boat spring out of the sea, which made the water foam. Our pump was kept constantly at work by one man, who was obliged to clear all the water before he was relieved. We had now 2 seamen sick, who continued below from duty till we arrived in the Downs, and then they found their way on deck again. While we were running through the Gulf, our captain sold some rum to the seamen, on which they got drunk, which caused me double labor till they were sober again. On the 6th of October we cleared the Gulf. On the 12th, having bad weather, we sprung our bowsprit, which our captain repaired with an oak fish, having no carpenter on board. But indeed such man was unnecessary, as our captain was not only one of the most complete and expert seamen I had ever met with, but also an excellent mechanic, being very ingenious. He could make masts and yards, mend a frying pan, or manage a ship with any man, and I have seen him make good cabinet work, for which purpose he kept various tools. The 16th we saw some waterspouts and had rain, thunder and lightning with heavy squalls. Finding our ship did not make more water while we ranged along the American coast, we ventured to run towards Newfoundland. The 22nd at night, the northern lights appeared very vivid. Having a fair wind when we reached the Grand Bank, we pushed on for England. But when we reefed the topsails, it was requisite for the captain to take the wheel, and myself ply the pump, we were so weakly manned. About the 10th of November we were greatly rejoiced at getting soundings, and the first land we saw, I think, was the island of Alderney, off which place we picked up almost a new bowsprit, but not large enough for our ship. Having got the pilot on board at Deal and some fresh provisions, we sailed for the river. Our pilot, seeing our cat Frolicsome, who doubtless smelled the land, and was running in and out of the bowsprit, became exasperated at the poor animal. He, being superstitious, concluded her gambols denoted a heavy gale of wind, which actually came on, and we rode out the storm in Margate roads. But I do not think the maneuvers of the cat were in any way connected with it. We got safe as far as Gravesend, the 2nd week in November 1788, where we received on board 2 custom-house officers and 2 excise men to watch each other. The next day, through rich mercy, we moored our ship in London River at the Guinea Chain. Our 2 seamen, who had declined duty ever since we left the Gulf of Florida, could now visit the deck again, and as they could at all times clear their victuals, I have since, on reviewing their conduct in my mind, concluded that their disease was a nervous affliction. We had not been many hours at the chain before something was sucked in the leak which suddenly stopped our pump. The merchants who took our cargo had never received such a one before, many of the hogsheads of sugar being nearly a ton weight, and I kept a good lookout to prevent plunderage on board. We indeed detected a man at work in the hold with false trousers, the bottom of which was tied round his legs, and had therein about 12 or 14 pounds of sugar, which was taken from him. I employed my old tailor to make me some clothes, who informed me that my brother was unable to pay the whole amount of his bill before he sailed for China, which I was sorry to hear, he having been liberally supplied with money. However, as I was then in hopes to have seen him again in Britain, I discharged the debt. Our cargo being delivered, it was our intention to load for Liverpool. Accordingly, a lighter came alongside with hogsheads of whiting to stiffen the ship for removing to a wharf. Our cabin being cleared of the sugar was literally black, where painted from the stench of the drainage of the sugar mixing with the salt bilge water, which was stinking much before we left Jamaica, and must have been very unwholesome, as the paint in the cabin first turned black, and then a silver or shining surface appeared thereon. Having taken in our whiting, we transported our ship to Drummond's Ways to search for the leak, where we cleaned the bottom from barnacles and caulked the open seams. But as the ice was forming in the river, we hurried to get to the wharf. Towards evening, we endeavored to heave in to Staunton's wharf, but a quantity of ice prevented us from getting the vessel square, and it was found absolutely requisite to heave off her bow to let the accumulating ice float away with the tide. It was now very dark, and though we had many watermen on board, only one could be prevailed on to run the warp out, the flakes of ice being so large and the cold so intense. But as I saw clearly that the ship was in the greatest peril, I jumped into the boat with a waterman, and we carried a warp out through the ice to a solitary brig at Pickle Herring swinging chain, all the other vessels having hauled to the shore. The man on the watch was very much against my making fast the warp, but by smooth words and hard arguments I got him to make it fast, and remained to guard it, whilst the captain and our crew hove off the bow of the ship. The next day, all the crews of the shipping on the Thames were busy securing them from the ice by laying down ponderous anchors in the streets, some of which had 6 or 8 bower cables fast to them, and the navigation was closed for many weeks. As far as I can now recollect, I think the wind continued to the eastward for about 10 weeks after our arrival here. Therefore, it was a very great mercy, considering our leaky condition, that we arrived before the easterly wind commenced. I believe many frigates were sent by government to supply homeward-bound vessels with water and provisions in the chops of the channel. The ice soon became so compact as to bear the discharging of cargoes on it, and a regular intercourse was carried on between the opposite sides of the river over the ice, especially between Tower Stairs and Horsley Down. Tents were erected in various parts on the river with colors flying, etc., to encourage riot and reveling. One day the ice separated on the flood tide into many islands, when I saw a very interesting scene near London Bridge, in tents, people, vessels, etc., floating towards the arches, and I actually saw a brig and sloop lashed together go through the center arch, carrying away their masts and pushing down a great many of the pillars on top, with many amazing heavy stones. Whilst we were laying at the wharf, the captain and myself visited 2 places of public resort, viz., Allhallows Church, to hear Mr. Wesley preach. The other place was Covent Garden Theatre. To this place I went to worship the prince of this world, even the devil, and to countenance immorality, profaneness, and dissipation. But this was in the days of my ignorance, before heavenly light began its dawn on my mind. Our captain's brother, an old tippling seaman, now joined our ship and was appointed second mate. Soon after this, a brig ahead of us, by inattention, was suffered to ground under our ship's bowsprit, the mate of which, to save his vessel from injury, was very busy in damaging ours with an iron crowbar, and would not desist when repeatedly requested. Finding words would not do, I ran out on our bowsprit to resist him, where we entered on blows, and finding I had the advantage of him, he seized hold of my hair, which was then worn long at the side, and tore most of it out by the roots. Our second mate coming to my assistance, he retired, but it was providential that we did not both fall on the ice during our battle. My hair on the other side was not obliged to be cut short to correspond. Having procured a stock of coals, our crew at night made a cinder fire in the steerage in an iron pot, and after closing the hatches, retired to sleep. In the morning, when I turned out, my head was aching, but was ignorant of the cause. I then called the crew and opened their hatchway, but not seeing the men appear as usual, I found they were ill, being almost suffocated by the sulphurous vapor of their fire. One morning 2 men appeared on board to pay their respects to me, one of whom informed me that he had been an officer in the ship with my brother to Bengal, and having heard of my being in London, had come in quest of me. They invited me to their lodgings and offered to introduce me to a lady of some property, but not approving of their loose conversation, I declined their great civility. Hearing that a gentleman of my acquaintance was confined in the King's Bench for debt, I paid him a visit, he having married a relation of mine. I found him in a room near the top of the prison with 2 or 3 more debtors who, in order to raise their spirits, had employed a hairdresser to play the violin to them. We got away from the wharf sometime in February 1789. On our passage through the shipping, we saw several vessels sunk by the ice. Our captain, having been brought up in the coal trade, thought himself sufficiently acquainted with the river to warrant his declining taking a pilot, but he was mistaken, and we grounded on a point on the ebb. But with much trouble we got her afloat again before midnight. We lay several weeks off Deal, experiencing many heavy gales from the south and west, in one of which the sea ran so high that I saw the very keel of an outboard-bound East India ship rising in a wave. Our second mate, taking the advantage of his relationship, was often on the skulk, neither keeping watch in turn with the crew nor assisting in turn with me, although it is not every old seaman knows how to keep the cable from getting round the stock or upper flue of the anchor in a roadstead. Many die from old age in the sea service that never attain to this knowledge, and numbers of shipmasters are also stupidly ignorant of this branch of seamanship, especially those not accustomed to the British coasting trade in tide ways. We at last got clear of the Downs, and beat to the westward as far as Falmouth, when towards night we endeavored to shelter there. But when close to the castle, in great expectation of visiting some of my old friends, the wind suddenly backed to the eastward, and finding we could weather the Manacle Rocks that night, we tacked and stood off again, and in a few days arrived at Liverpool. I was soon informed that the master of the Mayflower had been promoted to a vessel in the foreign trade, and this brig had been reserved for me in the Bristol trade. The brig, having been locked up for several weeks before my taking to her, the poor cat, being forgotten, had perished, and on my feeling something hairy in one of the lockers, I dragged it out to find that it was the skin and bones of a cat, the flesh having been eaten off by her old opponents, the rats. I was now given to understand that as the Bristol traders generally lay on the berth in Bristol for many months for goods, making little more than 2 voyages in the year, that the profits would not afford to pay a mate. Therefore, none would be allowed. Having laden a cargo of fishery salt and procured 4 men to work the ship by the run, I sailed for Bristol. When we had delivered our cargo, I laid on the berth to load for Liverpool, and as the Welshmen opposed us much, it was requisite for me to cruise the city for goods. I therefore hired a trusty old man at about half a guinea per week to stay on board and give answers while I was absent. He was no seaman, but professed quackery and did not like going aloft, and this was my chief assistant. After my return from procuring goods day by day, which were chiefly British spirits, I had to turn to in the hold and stow them. Soon after, I received orders to proceed immediately by coach to Liverpool to take command of the John in the Philadelphia trade, which was good news for me. Having taken my place in the mail for Birmingham, I arrived there at 9 the next morning, and according to orders waited on several manufacturers who were in the habit of sending goods to America, to solicit their favors for the John, a constant trader to Philadelphia, but could not obtain a single package, as the vessel, though only about 3 years old, was in very bad credit, as a slow sailor, always making long passages. I finished my business here in time to save the 12 o'clock coach for Liverpool, having 2 ladies, a mother and daughter, for my companions. We soon became sociable. We slept that night at Newcastle under Lyme, at a most wretched inn, both for neglect and imposition. But above all, the bed or bedding must have been damp, which gave me a violent cold and great pain in my breast, and which, I believe, continued till I sailed. Near Warrington, a partridge sprang up on one side of the road, leaving her brood to the mercy of the coachman, who stopped and, having put 7 or 9 young ones into his hat, handed them to the ladies, who took possession of 2 birds, which as soon as we gave them crumbs of bread, ate heartily, like young chicken. On my arrival at Liverpool, I found the John newly painted, rigged and ready to receive on board a cargo. Her cabin was fitted up with great elegance for passengers. The decorations were composed of plaster of Paris and gilded. All the bed places had curtains of a blue running chintz pattern with white fringe, and the whole was extremely neat and clean, which pleased me much. A new chief mate had been shipped prior to my arrival, strongly recommended. I was now enabled to sleep in a comfortable bed on shore till ready for sea, which appeared a great luxury. My wages while mate of the Thetis was £3 per month, and on being shipmaster was raised to £5 per month. But I do not think during the whole time I commanded a vessel, except my last voyage, that I ever made more in wages and prerequisites than barely £75 per annum. From this income, I had to assist 3 of my relations. I could save nothing, and out of my wages of £60 per annum, I had always to pay for my board whilst at home in Liverpool. This was a miserable income for the duty, anxiety, and responsibility of a shipmaster. The vessel, having taken in a cargo of salt, coals, and bales, we sailed from Liverpool to America the 17th of July, 1789. The 23rd, near to Scar, a strong gale came on from the northward, which soon made me acquainted that I was now on board a very badly constructed vessel, not having sufficient bearings at the bow to prevent her from plunging forecastle under when sailing on a wind. The 16th, we discovered that the fid of the fore topmast was broken, and the mast sprung, which we secured. The 29th, at daylight, we found a ship near us becalmed, whose boat came alongside to solicit for provisions. She was from Riobona in Jamaica for London. We spared what we could with convenience, and though I made a present of some of my cabin stores, the vulgar swearing captain paid for the provisions in light gold coin. The same day found the fid of our main topmast broke, and secured the mast with lashings. September 2nd, we got soundings in 73 fathoms, fine white sand on the Grand Banks of Newfoundland. The 6th, we spoke the American brig Neptune, 57 days from the Downs for New York, and we had been 51 days from Liverpool. The 9th, we had run the Neptune hull down astern. The 17th, we saw a quantity of birds, chiefly what is known to seamen by the name of Mother Carey's chicken, hovering near the water in direct line across our ship. When looking to windward, we discovered a dead whale, the oil from which they were feeding on. The 18th, we saw a sloop laying to on the whale fishery. The 19th, got soundings in 30 fathoms, and the same day in 15 fathoms, received a Delaware pilot on board and saw the land near 5 Miles Beach. The 20th of September, we saw Cape May and anchored on the ebb in 8 fathoms near the Over Falls. On the flood, we made sail and turned to windward in Delaware Bay, and as the wind continued contrary, we had to anchor on the ebb tides, till we arrived on the 22nd at Philadelphia and moored the vessel at Arch Street Wharf. On each side of the Delaware River, below this city, there are many marshes with reeds growing therein, which at this season of the year were in seed, and fed vast quantities of small reed birds, on which they got so fat as to be esteemed a dainty, like the wheat-ear in England or the ortolan in Flanders. As soon as I had a little time, I made inquiry about Mr. W.R.L., the passenger, who came with me the year before, being in the ship Thetis from Marseille. I found him at an apocarthes, studying psychic, dressed in the habit of a Quaker, with a large hat. As soon as I gave my name, he seemed rejoiced to see an old friend, and immediately locked his study, taking me with him to his lodgings in another street to get tea. He informed me that he was not only practicing psychic, but was editor of the Columbian magazine, and was then busy translating the life of Fredrick the Great from the French. After our vessel was discharged, having liberty from my owners to embrace a freight for any part most eligible, I agreed to take a cargo of wheat and flour to Barcelona in Spain. Our bark was very deeply laden, and we left the wharf the 12th of November. This season of the year here is generally clear of clouds and squalls, but very cold, especially with the winds that sweep over the lakes of Canada to this part. The next flood tide we brought up opposite Chester, an inconsiderable town in the Delaware state. The next place we passed was Wilmington on the same side. This town was built on an eminence, apparently of timber, and though the buildings were low and irregular, it had a pretty appearance from the ship. I saw in the Philadelphia newspaper an advertisement of a man who kept a store here, and it being a curiosity, I committed it to memory. It ran thus: cloths, middling coarse and superfine, figs, raisins, sugar candy, sago rice, pepper allspice, Madeira wine, and brandy. Good corduroys for men and boys, excellent Irish linen, jeans and jeanettes and vilverettes, and cloth of Jones spinning. Cloves, ginger, prunes, and silver spoons, both wax and tallow candles, bottles and corks, and knives and forks, with horn and ivory handles. Starch, mustard, snuff, all cheap enough, gloves, ribbons, gauze, and laces. Good Castile soap, all kinds of rope, bed cords, plough lines, and traces. brass warming pans and ladies' fans, queen's ware and pewter plates, half-gallon jugs and earthen mugs assorted well in crates, neat cover lids for feather beds, and clarified honey, good calicos and cotton hose, all cheap for ready money, sweet muscadine and Fayal wine, Venetian red and umber, brass curtain rings, and many things, too tedious here to number. The 14th of November, we passed the town of Newcastle, which is not very large. One of the houses had the year of its erection placed on it in large figures, which signified that it had been standing more than a century. We anchored next in the bay below the town, and the next day reached Reedy Island, a winter rendezvous for outward-bound vessels waiting for a fair wind. I hope you enjoyed this episode from the Journal of Samuel Kelly. Please like, subscribe, and follow on whatever platform you're listening. Be sure to check out the description to see how you can support this project and others. And tune in next time for more from the Journal of Samuel Kelly.